Welcome to this episode of Next Matters Most, where we speak with our guest, Chris Heivly. Chris is a self-proclaimed lifelong instigator. He has had a journey from corporate employee to entrepreneur to venture capitalist to running an accelerator to ecosystem building full-time to now sitting at a lake house full-time writing books. He's followed his passion consistently and hasn't been afraid to pull the plug on one path and jump into another just because it was more interesting to him. He also follows a rule of three, meaning he can have three projects that he is a lead on. Everything else he can only be a contributor to, which is a great organizing principle for all of us. Chris has been a connector, a community builder, and an influencer in the Triangle area for well over a decade. And it's great. And it's an honor to talk to him. I always love having conversations with him. I know you'll enjoy it as well. So Welcome to Chris Heivly, best-selling author and multiple time entrepreneur, founder, couple exits, big ecosystem builder. We'll try to get to all that and more, and then hard stop ourselves, before the top of the hour. But so Chris, I guess let's start with kind of your entrepreneurial journey, early days and a couple of the early sort of successes and failures you had, and feel free to give a 10-second overview bio as well.
Yeah, the bio I like to share with people is really short. I am a longtime instigator.
There you go.
And
it's a
so
1-second bio.
Yeah, the 1-second bio. And so everything you'll hear is just me trying to, figure out how to make shit better. So, my journey, I wrote this book, Build a Fort, which talks about how you should kind of think about doing your startups like you were building a fort when you were 10. But really going back to that, I really built forts all the time. And I think forts are a fantastic analogy for what the hell we do. And so maybe I was an entrepreneur. I don't have like the selling, shit door to door kind of story. And in fact, I didn't even know what an entrepreneur was when I got out of college. And I wasn't one. I went to work for, big, for the government, US government. And I went to work for a big $6 billion company. But when I look back inside, I was always kind of instigating new stuff, like we ought to be, and like not letting go of that. So whether you want to call that an entrepreneur or an entrepreneur, or I don't give a shit.
Yep. What about Mapquest? That was a thing that you have that sort of got me in trouble. I just date myself because I still will be like, oh, I need a Mapquest that. And it's like, what the hell is Mapquest? I'm like, no.
Well, anyway. anybody under the age of 30, it seems like these days, you're like Mapquest. And you're like, huh? Yeah. I'm like, Google Maps 9 years before Google Maps.
That's right.
Sold for $1.2 billion.
Yep.
Mic right. Drop. So it turns out, Nick and everyone listening, if you don't know the story, is that I was an undergraduate in geography. I was probably the worst geographer. You don't want me on your Trivial Pursuit team because one of the first classes I took was a computer mapping class, which is mapping being part of geography, and just like head exploded. And this was new because I'm really old. So this was like cutting edge stuff. And this wasn't, the desktop computer was not even around yet. That's how old I am. And, but I learned how to write code early on, which was unheard of. I was the only non-computer science guy in all my computer science classes. I probably had 15 hours and I learned how to write code. And later on, when I went to, first for the US State Department, then for this company, the $6 billion company, had a little mapping company, about 50 cartographers in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I came in there to automate, like from a tool, how do you use computers to make your maps faster? But then we just started a journey about saying, geez, the way we get maps and driving information just is stupid. For everyone who's like, under 30 or 35, you used to go to like get a triptych. Did your parents ever get like?
Oh yeah. I got one. I think I was like my college trips or so, early days, like I'd have to get the AAA highlighted route
Yeah.
In print. Yeah.
In
Yeah.
print, right? Like, and I
Yeah.
got to tell you, if I told you how like that sausage was made, you'd kind of just roll your eyes. But
Yeah.
that was our inspiration, saying, you know, there's a different way that we can do this. And the Mapquest story didn't start with the internet. The Mapquest story actually started with first we put it on. We sold to all those AAAs. We sold a system on a computer that printed those, and then we went to CD-ROM and even like the Apple Newton, if you remember that. And then eventually it was just the internet slash and became Mapquest. And
Nice.
we changed everyone's. Just as a cool little factoid, Nick, at that time, there was about 12 or 13 auto clubs like AAA across the United States. And collectively, if I remember correctly, they were generating 15 million triptychs a year.
Wow.
Not about you. I bet there's 15 million, you know, directions done a second today, right?
That's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's crazy. Well, both of those numbers are, you know, kind of surprising. Like, wow, 15 million. It seems like a lot of triptychs per year. Like that many people call in, did the request.
Yeah.
Yeah. In high school, I feel like I had I don't even know what you call these things, like a map, like it's like a large map in my back seat, you know, in case I was driving to like a soccer tournament or something, like just in case, you know, you had to get out the old map and figure out where you're going, or driving to and from college. There was the internet, but mobility wasn't really a thing. So you could like use the internet to print something, which got faster than just, you know, ordering it and receiving it. But quite a thing. So we'll switch gears to like then we met through sort of, well, I guess you then kind of went on to the investment side of things, and then ultimately led to kind of more like the ecosystem as a whole. But, you know, so you kind of had entrepreneurial experiences here in companies, well, big companies, you didn't know what you're doing, or you didn't know you're an entrepreneur, then kind of became one, and then kind of moved over to the investor side with, I guess what was it first? Was it Launchbox?
Yeah, Launchbox.
And then
but even before then, I actually did a stint as a corporate venture capital guy for that big company, that $6 billion company, which we spun Mapquest out of. Asked me to come, gave me $25 million post Mapquest in 1999, and said, hey, that was pretty cool. This internet seems to be a big deal. Would you want to go make investments on our behalf? And so I kind of learned how to do venture capital before finding myself, you know, reading about Techstars and Y Combinator and saying, wow, if one startup is cool, then 10 at a time should be a complete freaking blast, right? So, you know, just, you know, called up Techstars and a whole bunch of other places, including Launchbox, which was in Washington, D.C., and said, how do I do this? What's the magic? And got a lot of, knowledge, and met you. And I don't know if you know the story, but like when I started this, the first two people I went to were Jason Kaplane and Joan Seifert Rose. And they had breakfast with me. And I said, I want to go do this thing called an accelerator in Raleigh, Durham. I'd lived there about 2-3 years, and said, I need to know people. And so they made introductions. And over the course of about 5 to 6 months, I sat down with about 275 people for coffee, beer, lunch, whatever it took, and just said, all right, I'm going to instigate again. I'm going to figure out how to make this work in Raleigh, Durham.
Yep. What did you learn from the corporate venture world that made you want to go to the accelerator world? Because they're obviously different. But how did that kind of evolution take place?
Yeah, well, what I learned was actually something kind of really interesting. So in between 1995 and like 1999 or 2000, the number of venture capitalists tripled in the US. The internet brought that on. And I was sitting on boards making investments in companies with venture capitalists that didn't have a frickin' idea about how to run a company or operate. And it just was pissing me off. And so I got kind of disenamored with kind of, venture capital to some extent, because I thought that all the work should happen after you did the deal. But most of these people were basically numbers guys and kind of like, just trying to negotiate a deal. And then they go on to the next deal, right? Because they were just trying to like put this capital into play. And I was the opposite. I'm like, all right, now that we've done the deal, how can I help you? Who can I introduce you to? What kind of things can I share? And so when I saw the Techstars Y Combinator model come up, which was heavy on mentorship, I'm like, that's for me.
Yep.
Yeah. Plus my
That's awesome.
ADD, like 10 companies at a time, why not?
Yeah. I know. I'm still like struggling with that kind of concept of should I have one thing or how can you make your one thing all the things?
Yeah.
Like I really want to be like really good at one thing, but if that maybe that how can I make that be like my one thing I'm really good at is managing 10 projects. It's not, it's still TBD. Well, it's always
Yeah.
TBD. So, well, that's like, first of all, yeah, it's kind of going really like as I hoped it would go. But it's like kind of not in the typical way. I mean, you've got so many stories. I thought I would just ask a thing and then you just talk for like an hour and then I'd be like, boom, cut it. But each time you've sort of, it's funny. Like, yeah, like I was at a company, I didn't like it. Or I liked it, but I always wanted to kind of ask more questions. And so I was suited for a smaller thing. And then I latched onto this other trend, with the internet. So I got back into investing, but then like, it wasn't enough. I wanted to do that mentorship. So like your journey kind of took you on a path there. And I guess tell me post startup factory, and then, you kind of then got into that at more scale. And I guess actually went from the next evolution was really from like do 10 companies to like really zooming back out a little further to the ecosystem at large, which was also a big thing. So you're maybe on all these trends. Either you're on all these trends or you kind of got on them, well, hopefully you weren't doing all the investments in the bubble and then it bust and then,
Right.
whatever in the late 90s. But ecosystems were such a big thought. I mean, right now it's kind of maybe that we're still talking about it a little bit, but it was a huge deal and a huge priority from an economic development to, building innovation. But yeah, how did that kind of go from the investment to kind of more of the ecosystem at large, in terms of your
Yeah.
focus?
Well, I think there's two drivers, and I kind of joked, I kind of dropped a little seed, a couple minutes ago, which I think I need to pick back up again. And I kind of joked about ADD, and I've never been kind of like diagnosed, but I just know, by this stage, kind of later in my professional life, I just know that I get bored. I get bored after kind of 3 to 5 years. And, that's something I'm very aware of. And I just manage for it. And so part of the driver is that I get bored, and I need to do something else, especially something that I see that is broken or an opportunity that I really want to sink my teeth into. So post Startup Factory, during Startup Factory, as you know, I didn't just do the Startup Factory. I ended up doing a whole bunch of things, right? That all ended up being kind of ecosystem building things, right? I had a, before there was Grep, before there was, what was Procopio's thing,
Exit event.
Exit event, there was something called Triangle Tech Talk, right? Which was my way of kind of sharing, like, let's just share what's storytelling of the startup scene. I did the Big Top, job fair that got hundreds of people jobs, and got involved in, economic development and doing tours and telling people what this area is about and helping the Goodmans stand up, American Underground and all those things, working closely with Adam Klein. So, that kind of was feeding that stuff and started to learn a little bit about what it was like as, hands-on with our own Raleigh-Durham ecosystem. Post Startup Factory, I did what you're supposed to do. I just started kind of bouncing around and talking to people. And at one point, I'm talking to the Techstars guys, trying to convince them to replace us, to replace the Startup Factory with a Techstars accelerator. And I'm out in Boulder, and no one's paying me for this. I just think this would be the next thing that we should do. And as I joke with my wife, I went out there to convince these guys to come in, and the next thing you know, for the first time in 20 years, I'm going to go work for somebody else. And Nick, the story goes is that I'm sitting with Brad Feld, who's a guy that I admire, has written a lot of books and kind of a guru on startup communities and obviously lots of other things. And he said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, one of the thoughts I have is that there's 14 cities of size within a 4-hour drive of Raleigh-Durham. And they all come to Raleigh-Durham kind of, and you've seen them all kind of go like, how do you do this? What do you do? We want to build this, And I said, I'm thinking of helping them. And Brad said, well, David Cohen and I have been wanting to do this for a year or two. And we need someone to kind of, work with on it. Do you want to do it? And except we want to do it for the world.
Yeah.
And the answer was, of course, I'm going to do that with you guys for the world. So that's how and the idea was pretty simple. how do we take all of our experiences and all our thoughts about what makes for a great startup ecosystem, and how do we help others, achieve their goals in terms of building their ecosystem? And that's the business I built in Techstars for the last 4.5 years.
That's great. How many ecosystems have you built? Is that how you quantify it, or what's the KPI there?
Yeah, well, geez, that's like a whole other thing. So
Okay.
I'm a proponent that there should not be KPIs for building ecosystems. That actually, most of the times when you come up with KPIs, is the tail wagging the dog, and you end up doing things that aren't the most productive things for your ecosystem. We can go on to hours about that, but I think I counted today. We've had some kind of 3-month to 3-year contracts in 14 cities, from Fort Wayne, Indiana to Lima, Peru, from Kelowna, British Columbia to Taipei, Taiwan, and and everything in between.
That's great. Well, and I guess that's a great point. I mean, I think if you do a KPI that's sort of like standardizing it, and that's sort of the opposite of an ecosystem, which is supposed to be kind of holistically developed, based on what's around it, right? Like even in nature, it's like which trees are native to here, and then which sort of like that subplant, and then that subplant that then feeds each other. And you can't just be like, well, you have to have this, because what if that doesn't fit in?
Exactly. You can't force it. You can't engineer it. That's we call that the kind of top-down command and control approach, and that is completely the wrong way to do it. Great startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems are kind of ground up. You want to create connections as possible, and you have to kind of let go of the control aspect of this, because you cannot engineer an outcome in a startup community.
And so what did you, I guess I just said you don't measure KPI, but like, what did you measure, or what like kind of gave you sort of that sense of purpose? Like just going in and getting a contract and leaving is kind of like mercenary, right? But you weren't that, right? Because it wasn't, that's not. Yeah, that's right. So, it wasn't about that, right? It was about more than just that, but how did you sort of like loosely kind of understand either A, if you were successful, or B, just what was kind of the purpose or why behind it? I assume those were related, but maybe not.
Sure. Well, let me first address that there are some kind of measurement pieces, some KPIs, goals, or whatever, that are pretty standardized and clear. We'd like more entrepreneurs. We'd like those entrepreneurs to be more successful. Now, how do you define success? We'd like to see those entrepreneurs, so you could measure things like exits, which is dangerous because you can't force an exit. An exit is typically 7 to 10 years down the road. You could, some people measure the amount of venture capital, but let's look at 2 examples in Joe Colopy of Bronto and ShareFile, Jess Lipson. Neither one raised venture capital, and both had huge exits, right? Mm-hmm. So measuring venture capital shouldn't be necessarily the thing. A lot of economic development folks want to measure jobs, right? Like net new jobs based on this. But, you look at Instagram, when it was sold to Facebook, they had 13, 14 people in the company, yet that was sold for $1 billion. So, all of these things kind of create this conflicting view. The things that I try, the one thing I do like is I do try to measure and keep track of kind of net new entrepreneurs. Because if you're doing the job right, you got to open up the top of that funnel, and there has to be more entrepreneurs in the system. And that was actually my goal 10 years ago in Raleigh-Durham is, I could try to raise a venture fund. I could try to do all these other things. You know what? I want to go right to the core, from idea to launch. How do I get more people to make this leap? And in most developing or emerging ecosystems, not yet leading ecosystems, you never have enough entrepreneurs. So that's the one thing I measure. And then the other thing that we measure a lot is how connected is the ecosystem. And that gets pretty geeky, and I can't tell you we figured it out, but those connections seem to drive more entrepreneurial success than anything else.
Yep. That's cool. So, I guess we'll get to the next phase here in a sec. But, what were the dates? I'm just trying to think of, some people might be on that path of company to company to company. Others might be startup to startup. But even if you're in that startup path, seems like there's these different ways, and the younger folks might not like be thinking about that. But you couldn't just start out as an ecosystem builder, right? You couldn't just be like, oh, I'm going to go start out doing that. Or you couldn't start out running an accelerator, right? So some of that came from hard won experience, but not everyone's going to go that route, right? Some might go and just say, I want to do my next company and I'm just going to kind of stay focused. Is that like a byproduct of, the real or metaphorical attention deficit disorder, or just like, or what is that? Because I'm in that camp too of like, yeah, I need to do one thing. I'm like, oh, well, I can't really do one thing. I've got 5 meetings today. They're 5 totally different businesses and this interview. And I try to get one other right after so that I can like do my content for the month. But, it's like how, in terms of experience share for others thinking about where they're going on their journey, how, like, what are the, when you look at yourself, what do you think the kind of flip side of that might be for someone else, in terms of where they're going?
Well, all I can share is my own, addled mind and how I have tried to manage this over the last years. And this is, obviously something you and I've talked about a lot, for years when we sit down and just talk about our lives. The thing that I got to a number of years ago is the power of 3. And it turns out Brad Feld has the same fascination with the number 3. It's a really, it goes back, there's lots of deep shit and all this stuff. But for me, I just said, I can't have more than 3 things that I'm kind of the lead driver on. If I do more than 3, I get to a point where I've kind of sliced up the thing, my brain too much, right? And not any of the thing is getting, so I actually hold to that pretty fast. And when I get to an opportunity where I see I want to do something new, then I have to tell myself, what am I going to discard? It's kind of like some people do that with clothing. If I'm going to bring a new piece of clothing in, tell me the piece of clothing that's going to leave, right? Like I have to it has to always be net zero. Now, if you listen to me carefully, I said the things that I can lead, that doesn't mean there's things that I can participate in, right? But for my brain, like to wake up every day figuring out how do I move this thing forward, I have to limit that to 3 things. And then everyone else fights for kind of, and so I'm a big calendar block guy. I allocate certain hours of the day for certain things, and that's how I've survived. That may not address kind of the ecosystem versus company versus role. That's a personal thing, but I don't know. Is that helpful?
That's totally helpful. Yeah. And it's also kind of, I don't know, it's sort of, you saw like, you didn't know what it was at first that you kind of were gravitating towards. You just started doing something in that area, maybe as one of your 3 or one of beyond 3 of just kind of being involved. But then you've kind of did a lot with that. Investing should be more than just I write a check and move on. It should be getting involved. So what exists? Oh, I've seen these other models. Let me now do that model. And then, hey, these other areas are always asking us for, or even those little side projects that you had, right? We need this. I'm hearing it. I'm going to get involved, and then I do it. Right. Go ahead.
Right. There's a couple. Yes, thank you. And because there's a couple things I was thinking about that I think backs up what we just said. I remember when I had Triangle Tech Talk, and I was getting ready to hire Laura Baberman to work with her. This is before she did Exit Event, and said, let's do this thing together. And I had that, and I had the Big Top, and obviously I had the Startup Factory, and was getting pulled. And I remember I woke up one day and I said, you know what? I want to let go of this Triangle Tech Talk. I think there's others that are going to come in and fill the bill, and ended up being, American Underground kind of took over Exit Event, and then ended up hiring Laura to go do that. Like I could let go of that and say, now I can let go of that. I don't have to kind of lead that thing. And in fact, the community didn't need me to do it. It was picking that thing up on its own and going forward. And that was not as important to me, right? Obviously Startup Factory was the most important thing, and I can get involved in other things and replace that. So that's, an exact answer about how I manage that. Yeah.
That's dope. What exactly are you doing right now?
First of all,
where are you?
Where am I?
Yeah, where are you?
He's he's having fun, peeps. So pre-COVID, I was trying to find a way to slow down a little bit, guys. I'm getting kind of towards the end of my career, and especially with Techstars, the last couple of years, I've done 150,000 miles a year on airplanes, and we had gigs in Taiwan, and flying to India and all these places, and I was getting a little tired, and then so we decided to build this lake house in a place called Baden Lake for weekends and occasional weeks here, which is about an hour and a half west towards Charlotte. And it was finished May 1st of last year, right kind of in the breadth of the first phase of COVID. And, we're all locked down. So Patty and I locked down here. And so what am I doing now? So I left Techstars, handed over the business to Ian Hathaway, co-writer of Brad's new book about startup communities, and kind of consulted with them for about 8-9 months just to help the business to keep going. And now I'm just kind of writing another book. I just took a small consulting gig to help one of those 14 cities, help them grow their ecosystem, trying to help find some there's others in our community and that ask for help and want to understand what startup community, how do I bring all those experiences the last 4.5 years to Raleigh, Durham? So I'm getting involved in some of those conversations, and but I'm not owning anything, Nick.
Yeah.
I'm not like running anything. I'm not like building something. I've decided I'm going to take 1 or all years off from here on out and just try to, I'm trying to find second gear in this thing and not be that person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sitting at a lake, especially now with, post Memorial Day in the summer coming, so far it's working.
Yeah, man. When you said that, well, so you didn't quit obviously, but you're going from building entrepreneurship around the world, right? So like bringing entrepreneurship, building more entrepreneurs, bringing awareness, like you said, there's no real KPI, but those are the seeds that get planted that start to grow an ecosystem. I remember like the Brad Feld talk from years ago, if it's the 20-year plan or whatever. Actually, maybe that was his book, but he gave you probably were there. I don't even know if we knew each other yet, but he gave a talk at McKinney in the American Tobacco campus, and it was around that book, but it's like, it's 20 years. So a year later, it's still 20 years. And so you went from doing that around the globe to like, handing over that business and be like, dude, I'm living at the lake, which is another like awesome evolution in the journey of kind of knowing yourself, knowing what you want to do, and then just kind of going for it. And now, of course, gigs are coming to you, and this isn't like how to move into retirement, but I don't know. Don't you think, I would think that others, maybe myself included, would be scared to take that leap? And whether it's I'm retiring or I'm pausing, or I'm going to go off and just like have something going really well, and then just actually, I'm going to hand it over, take some time and whatever. Like, what was that all like, and how's that? We're all in the search for like purpose and fulfillment, right? What's the secret to life? You're just seems like you're just finding it.
Well, I'm searching for it.
That's right.
I can only know if I found it.
Well, you're antagonist. You're antagonizing yourself, right? Like, is this totally what I want to do? Well, no, but definitely not during COVID. So I'll do this. I'm going to live in my lake house.
Yeah. Well, you got to listen. I think our brains and the universe sends us signals, and we can listen to them or not listen to them. And sometimes people just kind of push them to the side. And I think that's part of being a great entrepreneur, is being very self-aware and listening to those voices inside our head and understanding how and where they come from and what they're trying to tell us. I think the biggest epiphany for me, Nick, was that I've spent the last 40 years building businesses and building high growth businesses which means the intent to just make them bigger every day, right? And that's a certain set of muscles, and it's a mindset, and it's exhausting, but I've loved every single minute of it. But my epiphany came sometime in July last year, and I woke up one day and I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And it wasn't doing Techstars, or it wasn't building that business that ecosystem development consulting business. It was, I don't want to build businesses anymore. I want to get off that train. I want to get off that. But I'll tell you, there's been good days and bad days, because there's some days I wake up and I'm like, I don't have a purpose, and it's like, bullshit, right? Like you call yourself out. I just have a different purpose, and the purpose isn't about, building business. And what I spend more of my time doing is helping entrepreneurs. I have open office hours. I've held them for 6-8 years. I still have them. I talk to entrepreneurs every week. I just don't have, my main purpose is how do I build a business for me? And because that was either exhausting or maybe that ran its course. I don't think I'll do it again, but I don't know. We'll see. Talk to me in a year or two.
That's right. Well, I don't know. In some ways, it's like actually like more purely or truly fulfilling kind of the purpose too, which is just kind of helping others. So less about, building organization and building scale around that as a model, and more about just like you're there and you're present and you can help. And that's an interesting evolution. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a group. You're looking for a really great book. Jerry Colonna runs an organization called Reboot. Former out of Boulder, he's a former venture capitalist out of New York. Fred Wilson's old VC partner, and I'm blanking on the book, but Jerry Colonna. He does a lot of work with venture capitalists, and it's a lot of mind and like who are you, and he has this wonderful newsletter and a podcast, and there's a quote in there, and I'm sure it's attributed. He's not the source, but he's attributed and carried forward, and I think it gets to the heart of what we were just talking about. And it's like, what would you do if you didn't care like what people thought about you? And the version I want to spin here is, a lot of us are on a certain career track or trajectory because we think that's what we're supposed to do. And my point of that is like, what would you do? And so I don't care that every 3 to 5 years I change gears. To some, I look like some ADD adult, job hopper or whatever. I gave up that thing sometime in my 40s, like 20 plus years ago. What would you do if it didn't matter what other people thought about you? Parents, wives, husbands, significant partners, right? Kids. Yep. What would you do? And so I think I've become very good at listening to that. And when those things bubble up, like not fighting them off, but kind of addressing them and doing them. And so I don't, if this is the thing in this moment, then grab it and embrace it, and if it lasts for 10 years, great. If it lasts for a year, great. Then there'll be another thing.
Story of my life, except I just haven't been doing it, because most of them, like sometimes I need to like find a way to think about those in more practical and pragmatic ways. Like live in Spain for the summer has been my thing, but I'm like, well, but kids, but like house, but how do we get the logistics? I think we got as far as finding someone who's in the travel business, like to start looking at places. And I think, it probably took us 3 years to get warmed up to the idea. And then I think we probably stumbled with COVID.